DJ Leroy.
Night Watchman. How you doing, buddy?
I'm well. How are you?
Good, good. So, Night Watchman, I understand and whatnot that apparently because of your deals with China, that the tariffs have been pulled back or extended. Tell me what's going on.
Well, I called my representatives in Japan and Canada, and I told them to crash the bond market, and that'll do it. And it worked like a charm. But no one will ever give me credit for it. So,
Uh, I mean, Night Watchman. This is why we always consider you big brain. This is why.
yeah.
Yeah, like, the
Okay.
long game. I love that.
I move in the shadows. Let's not talk about it again.
All right, all right. Well, Night Watchman, understand that just like fine wine, it's been aging, and that, of course, is the culture of hip hop.
Yeah, but I hopefully it refreshes itself. But we've got 50 years behind us, and it's been an interesting ride. And along that way, we have people who chronicled this thing along the way, and we brought three of the highlights of hip hop journalists on today's show.
Well, well, a Night Watchman, how can that be? Especially when I heard mainstream media saying that this stuff, this culture, was a passing fad.
Yeah, it's a passing fad. Why every other commercial has a hip hop beat on it. Come
Wow, wow.
on.
Okay,
Yeah,
okay. No.
yeah.
So,
There's revenue passing. That's what's going on.
what?
So, but well, listen. Let's not. They didn't. People didn't come to hear us talk. They came to hear our guests. So,
Well, you know what, Night Watchman, I'm going to do the honors. To hand it off to you. Who you got? Who you got on deck? Talk to me.
okay. So we have Mr. Michael Gonzales, and we're going to bring him on.
Good morning,
Mu-
gentlemen.
What's up, buddy? How you doing, man?
I'm fine, sirs. How you doing?
Hey, good, good. Now that you're here, especially because Michael and I, Night Watchman, you wondered why I never ran for public office. Is that correct?
What? Oh, Michael has the file on
He
you.
has the file. He has the file, and I do appreciate it. What, Michael, the check is in the mail. Okay,
Okay, I
Okay.
appreciate that. You're
you good?
always on time. Always on time.
Okay.
Well, we
Havelock
got
Nelson also
yes,
joining us.
Good
yes.
morning.
How you doing, buddy?
All good over here, my man.
All right, all right. A night watchman, another gentleman with a file on me. Okay.
Yeah, I think most of us have a file on you.
So,
All right.
well,
And
thank God. Who
last
else
but
you got?
not least, Mr. Harry Allen, the media assassin.
Yeah,
If he had a file on you, we wouldn't be talking to you about
exactly,
it.
exactly. I mean, behind those damn
That's
bars.
right,
So,
like Day of the Jackal, man.
uh,
You
uh,
just be out of here. So,
Harry, thank you for giving me a pass. Okay.
Not at all.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, gentlemen, welcome, welcome, welcome. So, Michael, I'm going to start off with you, man. Please, you got to tell me the origin story because I did hear, of course, from the background of history, working in city government for one of the agencies, man. Do tell.
Well, back in the '80s, I worked at a homeless shelter. I worked at a couple homeless shelters. Back in I think I started in '85, and I worked there until about '96 or '97. I can't remember exactly.
Mm,
But back in those days, the city was still in a whole lot of problems.
mm,
Crack had been introduced, and the homeless rate was just rising. And they were opening family shelters. I didn't work at a men's shelter. I worked at a shelter that was mostly women and kids. And there was some husbands there, but the majority were women and kids. So I worked down on the first I worked in Brooklyn
mm-hmm,
at Auburn Hospital, which is like when you go through Fort Greene projects, and
mm-hmm.
then later on I worked at Catherine Street Shelter, which was an old vocational school down on the Lower East Side, on like that, not too far from where the old post building used to be on off the FDR.
Oh, yes.
And
Oh, yes. But then tell me this, Michael. So, was writing always a part of your lineage, man?
Oh yeah,
That's
yeah. I
okay.
mean, I've been writing since I was 8 years old. I had a
Wow.
godfather who was a writer. I actually wrote a essay about him for a publication called Oldster. It's called Godfather's Hotel. And
Mm,
when I was 8 years old, my godfather asked me to dictate a story to him, and I
Wow.
dictated this story. I don't even know why he asked me to do it. I mean, I did it, and I think I just regurgitated some movie I had just seen. And later on, he bought me a typewriter for Christmas,
Wow.
and
Wow.
I was messing around, and by the time I was 12, 13 years old, I was submitting stories and poetry to different sci-fi and comic book magazines. I
Mm.
was trying to write comic book scripts, so I had gone up to DC Comics a couple times. I was 14. I was a student at Rice, and I
Mm.
would go from Rice to go meet with the editors over at DC. I never did sell a script, but they were mad cool. They were mad cool, and so I got a chance to not just learn how to write a script, because the editor who was up there was this guy Paul Levitz, who later became CEO of DC,
Mhm.
and Paul, he was a young writer. He was like about 19 or 20 at the time, and
Mhm.
so he spent time with me, and was teaching me how and talk to me, and then at the same time I got to meet some of my favorite comic book artists, and Neil Adams, and
Wow. Wow.
Rudy Nebres and Sergio Angeles, and just all these guys that were just up at the office. So
Mhm.
I went up there about 2 or 3 times, but I just was always encouraged to write. And by the time I was graduating from high school, I sold my first story. So that was that.
Beautiful. Beautiful. And Havelock, do we have a similar take on things in terms of your origin story?
Well, I started writing, I think, when I was in high school, and I had a teacher, a really cool guy. He was kind of a rock and roll, long hair, and talking and really like really, like a biker kind of guy. Really cool teacher, one of my inspirations. But he would always say, Havelock, you have a gift, you something about your writing. But I never really saw myself as a writer growing up.
Mm. Mhm.
I was going to be a technician, an engineer, that kind of thing. I went to Westinghouse High School, and I was
Oh,
doing that.
shoot. Yes.
So
Hmm.
I was all into math and science and that kind of thing, and the arts was sort of a side thing.
Gotcha.
But I was writing all the time. I went to college, to City College here in Harlem,
Oh,
and
yes. Yes. Hmm.
Steinman Hall was where I was heading. But along the way, I began writing for the school newspaper, doing record reviews for them. I think the first things I did was Donald Fagen's album, The Night Five, from the guy from
Oh,
Steely
heck yeah.
Dan, and
IGY, baby. Come on.
yeah,
Woo.
classic album,
Uh-huh.
and Marvin Gaye's Midnight Love album. That was my
Yes.
first piece of published writing,
Woo.
and from there the bug took, and I met a lot of people along the way, and it's like Michael. I met him at that shelter through a mutual friend of ours.
Oh
What got
yeah,
us
yeah,
together?
yeah, Mitch. I forgot about that.
Mitchell put us together.
Wow. Wow. See, see. Okay. So, Harry, you media assassin, do tell me origin stories, man.
Um, well, I started writing about hip hop because I became convinced that if it wasn't documented, it could disappear.
Wow.
I don't know if you all remember the Bill Cosby special that was aimed at kids called Black History Lost, Stolen, or Strayed.
Mm.
But I saw that as a young person, and it had a very strong effect on me. If you haven't seen it, he talks about a number of African American inventors and other intellectuals who came up with inventions or discoveries and were later wiped from history.
Hmm.
And I saw this right around the time that I started becoming aware of hip hop, and so I took on the task of writing. It made it my personal mission to document hip hop culture so that there would be a record of it.
Wow. Wow. And Night Watchman, I know you're laying in the cut because I do remember you also putting out some stuff because you were a big comic book fan. And just tell me about also the impact that these guys have had on you. All right? Tell me.
Well, I mean, even I think the impact they've had is on the culture, and by definition, it impacted me too. I mean, I think what Harry said is very telling and important. Is that that has been the history in the past. And even every era, so we have a new musical art form that we do, and we've always needed somebody to chronicleize it, because if we don't do it ourselves, somebody else tries to do it, and they usually do a crappy job of it. So I'm very, very appreciative of the work that the gentlemen have done. Harry, I want to find out more about how you developed your association with Public Enemy. And I regard them as being in the tradition of revolutionary intellectuals that whether it was the Panthers, whether it was the civil rights icons that we know about, that have always been the forefront of our change. So tell me, how did you end up connecting with that posse?
Well, I met them, I guess, in a way by accident.
Mm.
I was attending Adelphi University, and in the school newspaper, there was a comic strip that was being published every week, and it was called Tales of the Skind, Skind, and it was like, if you will, kind of like the Parliament Funkadelic little comics that you'd see on their albums, like a lot of in jokes, very black, very funky, and in the middle of uh, White Long Island, uh, it was like a respite. It was like a oasis for me. I was at a very white school. I wasn't College wasn't really something I took to immediately. I felt very much by myself,
Mm.
and so uh, after having endured a year of that, in the fall of '82, I started college in 1981, and in 1982, I registered for an animation class.
Mm.
When I went in for the first day, I walked in, and there was a guy sitting next to the chair, like next to the door, almost like if you had to leave or wanted to leave the class, it would be the perfect chair to sit in. I looked down, he was there scribbling. I looked down and I recognized the drawing style as the same one that I'd seen in the paper.
Mm.
So I said to him, "Excuse me, do you draw that comic in the Delphian?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "I'm a big fan of your work." And he said, "Damn, I didn't even know anybody was looking at it." And so we started talking. He told me his name. His name was Carlton Ridenauer, um, who'd be later known to the world as Chuck D.
Wow.
We realized
Wow.
that we both had an affinity and love for hip hop culture. What was interesting about that was that this was like 3 years after the release of Rappers Delight, which meant that hip hop had not even made a full transition against a graduating class. If you loved hip hop, you really had to declare it back then. It wasn't the kind of thing you assumed everybody was into, or everybody your age was into, especially if you were aspirational and in college. So for us, well, first I should say that Chuck then invited me up to the radio station. Now I had been going to the radio station with the hope of getting on air, but I was there during the day, and it was really dominated by a lot of white guys who all saw themselves as the next, morning zoo. Um, Invited me up on Monday nights. Monday nights was when his mobile DJ crew, the Super Spectrum Mix Show, took over the air, and it was a very black, very communal experience.
Mm.
Again, I want to emphasize that this was in an era when, again, first of all, it wasn't assured that if you were a young person in college that you identified with hip hop culture. It was
Mhm.
really a choice you had to make, because there were a lot of class issues, especially if you were aspirational. You
Mhm.
were in college to make your life better. And hip hop was a relatively new thing. And also, the common wisdom at that time was that hip hop was a fad and it was going to go away.
Yes. Yes.
Hip hop was a fad and it was going to go away. This was what regular, smart, educated, not people just knew was true.
Yes.
And as
Yes.
I think the best way I can put it is, as I've often said, when I met Chuck, Hank, and the rest of the crew, these were the first people I'd ever met who took hip hop completely seriously.
Nice,
That
nice.
that we it was never a debate about whether it was going to be around, and it wasn't just something we did because we hoped to meet girls or get into the industry.
Mm-hmm.
We were into the science of it. We
Mm-hmm.
recognized that it had formal qualities
Mm-hmm.
that were that were that were profound, you
Mm-hmm.
know, and meaningful.
Mm-hmm.
And so they became, I never joined a frat and was
Mm-hmm.
really not into frat culture at all in college. But the guys who had become PE, who were called Spectrum Mobile DJs at that time, became my frat.
Uh-huh. Wow, wow. You know what, Harry? Great, great, absolutely. So I'm now going over here to Michael, and saying, Michael, hear what Harry's just laid down here, man. And knowing you started out with your love of course, comics, right, and
Mhm.
storytelling. What attracted you to hip hop, man?
Well,
Do tell.
I had always been into music from the time I was a kid. I mean, the first album that I owned was the Shaft soundtrack, 1970.
Oh man,
Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
I remember
yes.
asking my mother to get me the Shaft soundtrack. I remember
Double
asking my
album.
mom to buy
Yep.
me the Superfly soundtrack.
Yeah.
Yep.
Oh,
Those were the
yes.
records that I owned. And then,
Hmm.
I grew up on 151st Street between Broadway and Riverside.
Hmm.
And one day, I think it was either 77 or 78, I think um, I had gone for a walk with one of my homeboys. It was actually the day I smoked my first joint, right? So and I was afraid, like, like you couldn't stay in the block because either my mother or my grandmother was going to come outside, or somebody was going to tell my mother or my grandmother. So like I tried to get as far away from the block as possible, and me and my boy Kyle were together. And I went to Catholic school, so I was kind of closed off from a lot of stuff that was going on. But when we returned to the block, there was a block party going on, and there was this stage set up, and two guys were on the stage who I later found out was DJ Hollywood and Lovebug Starship.
Mm.
And
Mm-hmm.
they were, spinning and rapping and spinning. And I just walked to it like, like when you see a movie of some guy walking in slow motion towards the light. And I'm
Yeah.
like, what is this? Like, what is it? I mean, and at the time, you know, nobody
Mm.
called it rap, nobody called it hip hop. And my boy Kyle, he just kept saying, "Yo, that's that new shit. That's that new shit." And I was
Yeah.
like, "Oh my god!" Like, I felt like I don't know, like something happened to me. And I
Mhm.
just remember, but that was also the year that I moved to Baltimore.
Mm,
So,
mhm,
I wasn't able to go to any shows or anything like that. I didn't go to the Audubon or over
mm,
to the Disco Fever, which was like right over in the Bronx.
mhm.
I didn't do any of that. But then Rappers Delight came out the next year. And, I mean, it just exploded on radio. I mean, black radio all over the country was playing Rappers Delight. And first of all, it was like the longest single on radio. And then And so by the time I came back to New York, I came back to New York in '81, and I was going to LIU out in Brooklyn.
Mhm,
And but I was back in, because I was back in the same apartment that I had grown up in because my grandmother lived there. I grew up with my mother and my grandmother, so my
N-
grandmother was still living there.
nice.
And I just started getting into the music, listening to stuff that was coming from people's boom boxes and stuff like that. Because I mean, like Harry said, a lot of young black people didn't listen to hip hop. I mean, look, most my girlfriend and they were all going to Bentleys and the Silver
Oh
Shadows
God, yes,
and I
yes,
love those clubs too, but
yes.
at the same
Mhm.
time, none of them were into hip hop. I felt like I was literally like, the little black duckling, and I just thought it was ghetto music and whatever. And I just kind of literally fell into it by accident. I mean, writing about it. I was writing for well, not just writing about hip hop, but becoming a music journalist. Period happened
Mm.
by accident because somebody asked me to write some reviews for their a fanzine that they were putting out, and I wrote about Fishbone, and I think I wrote
Oh,
the Beastie
yes.
Boys. But then the following year, I started writing for this Lower East Side newspaper called Cover,
Hmm.
and that was like I think that was '87, and so that was like the first big hip hop reviews articles that I was writing. I remember interviewing Africa Bombata, and
Wow.
I did a big piece on Daddy O from Sonic. I did a big piece on It Takes a Nation of Millions, which came out in '88, and you know, I mean, hip hop, it inspired me as a writer, and I just felt like I don't know. I'm kind of like Harry. I just wanted to document this stuff because I believed in it so much. I
Hmm.
loved it, and it just kind of became a part of my life. Now, I won't ever. I mean, I was a b boy, but I wasn't a b boy in the traditional sense. I wasn't wearing the sweatsuits, the Fila sweatsuits, and the sneakers and stuff like that. I always dressed rather conservatively, but I was always at the parties. People have I mean I've gone to many places to see a rap show or see some DJ spinning or you know whatever. I just love it, and I still love it. I don't go out as much socially as I used to, but I still love the music. I feel like the rhythm of the music has become a part of the rhythm of me as a writer.
Beautiful, beautiful. And Havelock, especially Harry. Thank you for if you don't talk about your history, your background, the stuff will go away. Remember, well, what we talk about that history is told by the winners. So I have to say, so Havelock also was music also a part of the component because I absolutely remember that too. And thank you for pointing that out, Michael. That definitely a class thing, man. Harry, you're right, a class thing and whatnot. That those educated blacks, they didn't listen to hip hop early on. They thought it was the lower class and whatnot, but yet it has found some daggone staying power. So, Havelock, your story. When did it come to you that I need to document what is happening here?
Well, I think I always liked music. I always was
Mm-hmm.
drawn to music. From being in Guyana, where I was born, I
Mm-hmm.
was getting all the Motown stacks, all the 45s, ABC records, all those things coming from my father, and
Mm-hmm.
who was here in the States. So when I moved here, it was just kind of cool to just see music artists on Soul Train, what's the other show with Dick Clark?
American Bandstand.
American Bandstand, all those things. Midnight
Oh.
Special. I used to love all that stuff. And as far as hip hop, I was more, homebody than homeboy, But
Mm-hmm.
when I went to school, everybody was talking about the Jam. I went to the Jam, and they would have tapes of the Jam. It was like these tapes that sounded like they were beamed in from outer space. Not very good quality, but
Mm-hmm.
you could feel the energy, you could feel the spirit, you could feel the creativity coming from them, and so in the summertime, that's when the Jam came to me because I lived across the street from a park, and
Wow.
one day they wheeled in some huge speakers. They put a table up, set up a mixer, turntables, and blasted music that was it was R&B music. It was love was the message, that kind of thing. But
Oh,
it was
yes.
not just
Yes.
played end to end. It was they were like cutting and just doing the breaks and just making it more exciting.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was my introduction to hip hop. And from there, I wanted to write about it because really nobody was doing it.
Mm-hmm.
You would see I would send in query letters to different magazines. They would just send me back and say, "Sorry, no, thank you." Because
Wow.
back then, like you said, it was also a class thing. They didn't think it was
Mhm.
anything that was worthy of coverage at that time. So I wrote for fanzines, Black Beat magazine, and Word Up, later Word Up. And that was the
Yes.
time when you could really, you could run into an artist on the street and just
Hmm.
say, "Hey, man, I heard your record. I want to interview you." And it was like that. That was the transaction.
Hmm.
Or you would meet somebody coming out of Detroit. I met Bow-Legged Lou from Full Force coming out of Detroit. And I said, hey, aren't you from, of course I knew he was because he had the big Full Force jacket. On. Great, I was Full Force, So he came on his bicycle to my mom's basement and we did an interview there. And that was before Lisa came out. That was before Roxanne came out. So back then you could really be intimate with these artists. If you get an interview, you would go to their mom's house. You would sit in their bedroom. You would sit in their kitchen, their living room and do the interview. You would go to the studio where they would just be mingling casually. And
or if they had a publicist, they would just give you their home number.
Yeah, I mean, that's what happened later. Later on, that's the way it became.
Exactly, happened later.
But back then, you had access, and artists spoke freely. They weren't, limited to the talking points or, saying, don't mention this and mention that. They spoke freely. They told you their stories. If you wanted to know about it and you asked the right questions, they'll tell you. And that was the best part of hip hop, that early beginning of it when it was just embryonic. And,
absolutely.
No one really had any ambition of other than getting onto the mix show on the weekend and being a hit on the block the next week.
And if I could add, at the time, I couldn't have imagined it. I used to actually think about this because I knew that in rock and in other pop genres, it was far more structured. And I thought that hip hop would never be that. In other words, I never thought it would have the character where you would have to go through layers of people to get to somebody. Exactly. I knew it would become big and popular. I didn't think it would become global and dominant the way it did, but I knew it would be big. But like Havelock was saying, it was far more casual and it's far more interesting in a way than when it was less commercial. But I used to think about that. Like I used to think hip hop would retain that character where you would, it would be casual and you'd interact with artists. I didn't think it'd ever get this structured and distant.
The other thing too is that at that time, now hip hop is everywhere, but at that time, hip hop was a New York thing, and we were all New York writers. You know what I mean? So, Havelock is being modest because his old neighborhood was like hip hop heaven. Like there was, Special Ed lived around the corner. Havelock and I lived together for a while when we were.
I was pre-Flatbush for a while though. That was the blast was before Flatbush.
There was a lot of people over there. Going
Absolutely.
uptown. I met different rappers on the train and stuff like that. I remember seeing Red Alert.
Busta Rhymes was on New York Avenue.
That's how I met Red. I met Red on like the 3 train or something like that, and it was just, it was a New York thing. I have nothing against other places, but at the time it was just New York, and we were here, and we had easy access to a lot of these people.
Nice. And of course, Harry, remember now, we know this is not Wakanda, baby. It's BX. So I'm originally from the BX. Club 371, okay, Clay Avenue, right there. So my question was, and this is before, of course, social media and all that stuff. So what was it like? What was the turf like, man?
In what regard do you mean?
In terms of, let's say, getting it out, like this particular explosion of inventive creativity, it's coming. So how was it spreading? Like a virus, quickly or subtly?
Well, I think it was exploding via the power of the music, and I think that there were a lot of channels. Like one of the things I've long said is that there's yet to be a history done on the spread of hip hop via the U.S. military.
What?
By that I mean by soldiers who would come home, who would spend their money, first of all, on stereo systems, because when you're in the Army, you don't have a lot to spend money on. Stereo system. Record tapes, bring them home, get new music, share them with their friends, or play them in other countries. Like there was this whole informal network of music being spread around the world and here within the States as well by people in the military. And I think this is completely uncovered.
That's a really deep insight. It reminds me that even prior to hip hop, like I had cousins in the late '60s who were in the military, and they go over, and when they came back, they had Sansui reel to reels, and they had all this crazy equipment, and they would do mixtape parties with the reel to reel where you could get like 2 or 3 hours of music on a tape, and that was really like the first mixtape. This is pre-cassette,
Right.
um,
Wow.
but you're right that that movement from soldiers is an undocumented phenomenon that definitely connected to the music. And I think that when hip hop came along, that activity was already in play from the Vietnam era of soldiers coming back and forth.
And I would add to that. I would say that of course hip hop arrives as the cassette is a mature medium. It's not experimental at that point.
Right.
Wow. Wow.
Now,
Yes.
the 8 track was like kind of it was an incredible medium. 8 track
Hold on. Harry, you went there? A-track? Really? Go ahead, man. Let me
A-Track is like a one hit wonder. It
I
was there for a little bit.
remember Jimmy
But you
Walker
couldn't,
doing
you
the
couldn't rewind 8 tracks. That was the problem.
you couldn't rewind them. You couldn't record on them. I remember
Yeah.
Jimmy Walker doing. Panasonic had these red, white, and blue. Not one color, but red, white, or blue. Uh, Push down eight
I
track
remember those.
Oh my.
plunger on top, and they had Jimmy Walker because this whole thing was dynamite. So they had to put like a dynamite
Yes.
explosive
Yes.
switch. They had him advertising these. It made an impression on me for some reason.
Oh my God. Oh, so Michael, are you telling me that you did not have any 8 tracks? Tell me, man.
Oh hell yeah, I had 8 tracks. I mean, but the 8 tracks that I had, well, I didn't own them. Every year I used to go to Pittsburgh, and my Uncle Ed and my Aunt Ricky both had 8 track players
My
in the
parents did.
in the car. I mean, I remember when my uncle had a pickup truck in the average, and I think it was the Cut the Cake album, the one that had Schoolboy Crush on it, and the tape got stuck in the player. So all summer long, every time we got in the truck, we had to listen to Average White Band.
Oh.
So when Eric B. and Rakim sampled Schoolboy Crush, I was like, "Oh my God, here we go again!"
It was a portable playback medium. You could put it in your car, and when you think about it, there wasn't anything before that you could do that with. Where you could take your own music with you in a car and play it back. And so it found a lot of traction with us.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I do remember,
You couldn't do that with a reel to reel or with a record.
nah, not at all.
Yeah.
But when you talk about stereo systems, I remember. How many of you guys remember this store, Lafayette?
Of course,
Yeah, high end. That was high end, man.
where I bought my first amp from Lafayette.
Oh, are you
You know,
really?
and I
57th
got my
Street.
first cassette
Yes,
from
yes.
Crazy Eddie.
Exactly. And now remember,
This
I
place
think
are insane.
yes. But it's so funny that you mentioned Harry. When they were actually doing the demo for the stuff with the speakers and everything, they wouldn't use any hip hop. I remember them using what was their name? Oh God, James. One of the white dudes rock music would be the sampler that they would show you the
Wow.
quality of the stereo and the speakers, man.
Hilarious.
You
Yeah,
cannot.
I remember when I bought my what I probably bought like a bookshelf stereo. I took a copy of Davy's Ride by
Wow.
DMX.
Wow.
And played Ready for the Treble Fresh. I wanted to hear how that sounded on the stereo.
Gotcha. Oh, so Havelock, what was your system like, man?
Well, I had my mother had she had a console system.
Console.
Yeah, with a ceramic cartridge, and
Wow.
it had a pretty good rumble.
Uh-huh.
There were two-way speakers. They weren't that booming and powerful, but my brother-in-law, he was in the military, and he brought back a system that was just to die for. It was it was just the way the dials were lit, the
Yes,
way
yes,
the grill on the speakers looked,
yes.
and the shine on the walnut. It was just like, wow, man. And the turntable, it was so quiet. So I would go over to his house. He had a huge collection of records, and just talk music and listen to records and that kind of thing. And that's where I would really get my audiophile on until I convinced my mother to get a better turntable, and maybe she get some three-way speakers, that kind of thing. So
Wow.
that was my roots. I used to make a lot of tapes from radio. Songs I liked, the mix shows on 8-track tape. The one thing I
Oh,
hated though,
wow.
you couldn't
Wow.
rewind an 8-track tape.
Oh,
So you have to fast forward all the way back to from track 3
Yeah.
through track 4 to track 1 to the where your song ended to record over again. But
Oh.
yeah, that was
Not good. Not good at all. and Night Watchman, I do remember that, of course, we didn't call you a mixer. We did call you a blender.
No, I could mix. You never could mix. I could mix. I had my GLI turntable. I had my 1200s. I could mix. I could still mix. So don't get it twisted. You're talking to the wrong one.
I hear you, bro. I hear you. Well, you know what?
My first thing. So I took a turntable from an old console thing and built a wooden base for it, and bought my Lafayette amplifier. And then I had 2 speakers that didn't have enclosures that I got from my dad, who was an engineer. I don't even know where he got them from.
CCNY, that's right.
Plugged them in with alligator clips, and that was my first version of it. My brother, who had a job before anybody else did and actually had money, he took kindly to me and bought me some real speakers, some Jensens, And then I just kept evolving it. I got a Lafayette mixer when they came out with a mixer, and you could plug 2 turntables in and a microphone, and they didn't have queuing yet, but that was coming. And you see the different iterations of the technology and how it changed the music, from turntables to actually samplers coming in. And, it was really, interesting to see it. And then to go along with the different cycles of music, because, I started out, my first single that I bought, 45, was the Honeycomb One ads.
Wow.
But the big day was when we went into 5th grade, and so these kids, they're our age, they got a single, they got a record. It was "I Want You Back," So,
oh my God, yes,
first generation, Jackson 5 was interesting, and then going up with all that James Brown funk, and then the day when we went to the record store, and there's this album, and it's got a spaceship landing in the ghetto, the Mothership Connection,
Yes.
So all these seminal increments of music that then led to hip hop, which then pulled from all of it, to create something totally new and different, is just amazing,
Yes. Go ahead, Harry. We got you.
So one, I find it fascinating that we can all relate to the indignities of the console. Big stereo that was built like a piece of furniture.
Oh, it was a piece of furniture.
It was.
It's a box, like a coffin.
Yes.
Yeah.
Turntable, probably a radio.
Yes.
Track player, whatever.
Yeah.
But it seems that, so 2 things come to mind. So one, in everyone's hip hop story, there's an inflection point where they realize the possibilities of technology, where they go from that to seeing or hearing something that's better.
Yes.
Wow, I didn't know that stereo could sound like this, or be like this, or a record could be this quiet, or whatever. It seems like there's always that, or a series of those kind of moments that kind of like bring you along. And then it's always fascinating to me that often that when you talk to DJs, in a lot of cases, they're people whose dads usually had extensive record collections
Mm-hmm.
and who had stereo equipment of a fairly high quality.
Yes. Yes.
They often talk about that in the home. And it's interesting because what you realize is not everybody does that. Not everybody makes a big deal of equipment or records or throwing parties in their homes. But in the case of DJs, whenever you talk to hip hop DJs, you often see that. My dad had a stereo equipment. He had a lot of records. He took great care of it. I was fascinated by it. You hear
Yes.
that,
And they couldn't touch them.
and they
But
couldn't.
what
That's
they
it.
did.
They weren't. They weren't allowed
Forbidden
to
fruit.
touch it, but they snuck it, and that was the Damascus sword. That was the electricity going through them. That was the origin story for them touching it and seeing what it could do.
Wow, wow. Now, you know what? Okay. So what I'm thinking about, one of the seminal moments that I remember, because, I was a big fan, of course, before of disco. Okay. I dug some of the instrumentation, the beats, and we certainly do know that it was one of the early stages in terms of sampling, right?
It was also one of the terms by which early hip hop artists referred to hip hop.
Right.
Mhm.
You're right.
That separation between disco, club, that wasn't there in the early days. It wasn't.
No, that's true. Yeah.
It couldn't be there because they were using those records, playing them at the block parties. I mean,
Mhm.
Yes.
this was around the time that the 12 inches started coming out. I think
Do
Party
you remember
Glass.
the first time you saw a 12-inch? That was like the mothership land. What is this? It's a giant
All of
single
that stuff.
for
People were
10%.
playing,
Yeah.
Foxy's Get Off and, playing all these different disco songs that, before people started rapping over James Brown or whatever, they were
Yep.
rapping over it. Because with the 12 inches, it was usually one side was an instrumental and the other
Yep.
side was the vocals.
You
Right,
got it.
right.
You got it. Absolutely.
And
So
also, it was aspirational. I mean,
Mhm.
at that time, you wanted to be able to get into those clubs. It wasn't like,
Mm.
oh, I hate those places. We're going to make our own music. It wasn't that way at all. You can't get it.
They called the disco fever.
Good. It was great mystery in what was going on in those places.
Wow.
You saw the outfits, like these guys didn't wear street clothes. They wore some outfits, trying to fit into what's happening in the mainstream world where they wanted to be.
Yeah.
They wanted to get,
Absolutely. Go ahead.
No,
Go
I
ahead.
think they were all aspirational. It was all
Yes.
aspirational.
Well, tell me about this, because remember, guys, that seminal moment. I believe it was in probably White Sox Stadium or whatnot, where they're burning the disco albums. Remember that?
Right.
Okay.
Disco Demolition, it was called.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. Now, does any of you guys think that similar type of revolt would happen with hip hop, or no?
No,
Yes or
it
no?
can't happen now because hip hop has infected. I would say that when I was growing up, there was, black music and there was white music, and there was a little bit of an interchange between, there was certainly some of the, what I call the white soul artists that we and, you saw Frankie Crocker kind of mixing the genres a little bit. But basically, growing up in high school, the white kids liked the rock. We liked our funk and R&B and disco and eventually, this is past high school for me, hip hop and rap. But we have a generation where the entire young population of America has grown up on hip hop.
Yes.
And so there's never going to be that division that we've seen before. As Harry mentioned, hip hop is a global phenomenon now. You have great hip hop coming out of India right now. It's
But
crazy.
I mean, every pop record is built on the foundation of hip hop. I mean, all the breaks that Kool Herc and all those guys came up with.
Right.
Every pop record has that underneath it.
And
It's all throughout pop.
Yes.
And every TV commercial. You're hearing hip hop beats on State Farm ads, and
And sometimes, I mean,
Every rock band has a rock beat. It's all hip hop.
Mhm.
Last year they were using Black Sheep, the choices of yours, probably on 2 or 3 commercials. I'm like,
Right,
how
exactly.
many
You could get with
commercials
this.
are the same song?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree with what everyone's saying, but I would never say never. That is to say that the thing that disco demolition thing, and what I didn't understand this in high school.
Uh-huh.
It was a racial event.
Oh yeah. Oh
Absolutely.
yeah. Oh yeah.
Absolutely.
Totally.
And
Totally.
I used to hear. I remember. You know.
Look where the park was.
I remember hearing like. I remember one of my schoolmates making a joke about disco, and I didn't get it.
Uh-huh.
I didn't get the racial dynamics at the time.
Uh-huh.
To me, disco was great. It was fine. You know,
Yep. Yep.
every single record, but I loved disco. I didn't
Mhm.
understand that there was a fundamental cultural divide between white and
Mhm.
non-white people yet. I didn't really get it yet.
Gotcha.
And so I would never say never. In other words, just the same way, like, you know, one could have said a few years ago, I could never see in America where you would get deported without a trial or without
Wow. Wow. Yes. Yes. Yeah.
or all kinds of things that are happening right now. I
Yeah.
Man.
see a situation, but I think that as my colleagues are implying, something drastic would have to change in the culture of
Mhm.
that. And I could see something drastic happening and changing in the culture. You know, like I've been watching The Handmaid's Tale, and
Mm.
that's about a
Mm.
future America
Yes.
where
Yeah.
drastic has
Yeah.
happened. And I
That's
see
right.
like drastic results, and I could see future white kids making allegiance to white music out of a cultural dynamic and drive. I
Well,
could see that happening.
well, Harry. Then answer me this, okay? Because we certainly do know, in terms of American music, our people touch all of it. So the early pioneers of rock and roll, us. So
Right.
how did we get taken out of that equation, man?
Necessity. Like 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 I think that I th- I think that it's like why do white people say cool? You know,
Mhm.
that's black
Gotcha.
slang. That's
Right.
black jazz slang or
Hmm.
high five. That's you
Yes.
know, like
Yeah.
these are all gestures
Yeah.
and and totems and culture that
Yes.
black people come up with.
Hmm.
White
Hmm.
people eventually adapt and adopt. You know,
Uh,
that's
eh,
a big draw. You know, scholars talk about the Africanization of American culture,
mm,
and it's an
mm,
underanalyzed phenomenon. How white people become more black than they otherwise would be because of the presence of black people, but deny it, especially through racism. Racism
yes.
is racism is the way you hate the one you love.
Wow. So I can embrace that culture, but not the people.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So
Gotcha.
I want to ask you guys, what do you think about hip hop today?
Who you want to start off with? Michael? Do tell.
I mean, I have to confess, I don't listen to a lot of hip hop today. I mean, okay, that I listen to a lot of old hip hop today.
Okay.
Okay,
Okay.
if I'm listening to whatever, I listen to the people that I grew up with. I think with certain, you know, with me anyway. Like after the early 2000s, and maybe because I stopped writing about it as well. I mean, writing about it as much. And so I just, nowadays, like I'm just content listening to, you know, 80s stuff, the stuff that whether it's Just Ice or Boogie Down Productions or,
Mm, hmm
or Mantronics or whoever. I like listening to the old stuff. But that goes kind of across the board for me. Like I don't listen to a lot of new rock and roll. I don't listen to a
hmm
lot of new jazz.
hmm
The stuff that I listen to usually, I mean, and the only time I really write about music now is for a British magazine called The Wire,
hmm
and I
Well,
write about a lot of reissues.
hmm
um, I know. I mean, I'm going to be 62 this year, so
You old guy.
my taste just is kind of stuck in like back in the day.
Gotcha, gotcha. So
Yeah, I'm with Mike too. I think it's the same
got
thing. I think I hear things that I like. I think some of the beats are fantastic in the new hip hop songs, but I can't really name the artists that are attached to them, or what they're talking about. I think I heard a guy named Gunna that I kind of liked a couple of days ago. And so there are people that I hear that comes through, but I don't go intentionally, saying I want to get that record, because I'm around a lot of young people and they talk about a lot of artists, and I sort of quiz them on why they're good, kind of thing. And if they give the right answers, I sort of would go home and say, okay, it's a quiet moment now. Let me just go home and check this out, that kind of thing. But
Can I throw in one thing for a second?
Yeah, go ahead.
You know what I did see and like is this woman Doechii, who
Doechii, yes.
She did a Tiny Desk on NPR.
Yes.
And I didn't listen to her record, but that Tiny Desk was one of the dopest things I've seen in a long time.
Yes,
I agree.
I think Doechii is the breath of fresh air for hip hop right now. The first real original artist I've seen in a while. I just see a lot of variations of the same kind of archetypes going around, and I just feel like I'm tired of them. I'm tired of some of the old, overly worn themes that have permeated corporate hip hop.
Wow.
Yeah,
Wow.
I think it's the same for me. I think the longer I live, the thing that surprises me the most is realizing how ordinary I am. And a lot of the things that I thought I could resist, like I thought at one point I would listen to hip hop forever and acquire. I mean, there was a point in my life where I realized I couldn't buy all the records, buy all the records that were being released. Then I realized I couldn't because there were just too many. And now, I mean, I realize like a lot of new hip hop, I think, is not aimed at me or a person my age or
yeah, definitely not.
It's talking about very youthful concerns, and I can't pretend that I haven't answered these questions for myself already. Like, like if you're 21 or 22, you have a lot of questions and drives that by the time you're in your 60s, you should have answered. And so if the records are about that, it's not like a satisfying experience. Now, but I got the biggest thrill of hearing Souls of Mischief redo 93 Till Infinity, which they did for Red Bull. They just did a reworking of it that was like awesome. Like stunning, like beautiful, like art, the best thing I heard last year. And what's the name of that group, Costa? Oh man.
Oh yeah, I know who you're talking about. Costa.
Retro group. It's like they're a retro group, but like it's not quite retro. It's not retro in the way that Jurassic 5 was retro. It's like retro, or like redoing it with a modern sensibility. It's like a resto mod hip hop kind of like,
right?
Which I find
with some lyrical skills.
Yes,
I think that's a key for us because we grew up in an age where we saw the progression from early hip hop to a point where the lyrical styles were just incredible and really, just the artistry of what people were doing with hip hop and still some of the old ones. I mean, I think, MCs like Black Thought, I can listen to them forever. Whatever, and they come out with new stuff. I want to listen to it. I want to hear what Redman has to do whenever he comes out. But when I hear Doechii, I was like, okay, there's some life in this thing still. I'm curious to ask you guys what you thought about Kendrick Lamar and his Super Bowl performance.
Man, there's so
go ahead.
I'm trying to understand it still because I really had discussions about what the symbolisms were, and there's a lot in there, and there's a lot I really didn't understand about it. So I'm still trying to learn about it.
Gotcha.
But I think that's also a good thing. We should have art that's dense, that is not immediately, we don't need McDonald's art. We need something that has some layers to it. And hip hop is a place where you can, there's so much dense information you can put in a hip hop rhyme. So to have layers, but even in his performance, there were so many different layers that were layered in between the beef with Drake, which is kind of like an ode to hip hop themes of beef. But he took it to another level, and I think made some interesting social commentaries on the biggest stage. So I ultimately liked it because it made you have to kind of think about it and maybe go watch it again and see what was going on.
Conversation, that kind of
that's
thing.
the thing that a lot of people have gravitated to, and I think you're correct that there's a lot of culture that's being released now that doesn't bear repeat consideration. And he, with this Super Bowl performance and on this massive stage, that he built this hypertext.
Yes.
And that and people were actually amazed when they realized that it had levels and layers of meaning to it, and pursuing those layers and trying to decode it became its own kind of activity and its own kind of regard for Kendrick Lamar. And there were a lot of people who hadn't experienced that before. They hadn't experienced art which could be deeply read. A lot of it is, as Bob said, is like quick serve. Like it doesn't mean anything more than what it means and what it appears to be. You almost can just watch the video and know what it's about without
Absolutely
the song at all. But that wasn't the case for what he did there.
Absolutely. Well, Night Watchman, can you say lightning round?
Yeah, we're wrapping up, so we want to give each of you guys a chance to just kind of give us some closing thoughts and maybe tell us what you've been doing lately.
And what's coming up. Michael, begin.
Okay, I still write a lot of essays. I write for Crime Reads. I write a lot of true crime for them. I write crime short stories. I had a short story published in the Ellery Queen Mystery Magazine last year called "The Life and Times of Big Papa" about a Harlem number banker.
Nice.
I have an essay about Black bookstores in this new book called Prose for the People, which is a celebration of Black bookstores by Katie Mitchell. And that's about it for now. I mean, I'm actually in the middle of writing an essay about Wilson Pickett.
Nice.
For a museum in Nashville that's doing a show on Muscle Shoals on Fame Studios, where Wilson Pickett recorded for years, and a lot of people recorded down there, the Rolling Stones and Aretha Franklin, and so they asked me what I wanted to write about, and I grew up. I was born in '63, and my mother always tells me that when I was a kid, when I was a toddler, I guess, my favorite song was Wilson Pickett's Funky Broadway.
Very nice. Very nice.
So I would be dancing to it. So so when they asked me if I wanted to write an essay for the catalog, my thing was, yeah, and they were like, well, who do you want to write about? And, I love Wilson Pickett's voice. I love his songs, but I didn't know a lot about him. So I figured, I could get paid, do some research, and learn about the Wicked Pickett. So that's what we're doing.
Thank you, bro. Thank you. And Havelock, what you got going on? What's coming up?
I dwell more in the culinary world these days, so I'm going to make a key lime pie in a few minutes. But I do have some footage in the arts world on Ernie Panicoli, the photographer from Word Up Magazine, that I've got to find the time to put into a coherent story about him. I mean, it was a fantastic interview that I still have in my head resonating. And we got to just find the images and find a way to tell the story that pays him the respect that he deserves. So that's coming.
Nice. Thank you. And Harry, what you got going on, buddy?
I just want to pay compliments to my two co-guests. I've always thought of the three of us that Michael had the most style as a writer, and I've always been impressed by the breadth of his subject matter and just his gift for the pen. And I would say one of my fondest memories, I don't know if this is true for Havelock, but it was for me, was a time we were out eating and we ordered rabbit. And
what? That was for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
he didn't like it.
No, it's the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame dinner.
And then I started, I just pursued him with it the entire night. I just kept moving it. So,
I do remember that.
Harry, thank
It
you
was
very much, sir.
7th Avenue we were on. A restaurant on 7th Avenue. I remember it well.
Oh my!
But I would say for myself, I stopped considering myself a freelance writer about 10 years ago, and with a lot of trepidation. I'm speaking to you from my office at Harvard University, where I'm in a fellowship. This is the second time I've been up here. I'm a Nasir Jones Hip Hop Fellow here at Harvard.
Wow!
And I'm developing. I don't know if you can see this or if it's reading backwards or not, but I'm developing a band called Harbinger that I founded at MIT. I did a artist residency at MIT in 2020, and Harbinger is a turntablist septet. That means 7 hip hop DJs who play at the same time.
Wow. Incredible.
Together, like a small combo. And I'm doing work developing them. I think at that time I decided I less wanted to talk about hip hop and bemoan the lack of innovation in it than address that myself. So I've been able to line up a number of fellowships over time and working on developing Harbinger to be a true, I like to say a Kronos quartet of hip hop, like doing real experimentation music. And there are lots of good things on the way.
Nice.
It's been a very rich life for me, less dealing with writing and deadlines and all that kind of stuff, and just more like kind of experimenting. Like it was said before, like with the history of hip hop, pulling from it and working with that.
Beautiful. And Night Watchman, of course you're going to take us home, but before you do, will they be invited back to the cookout?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
All right. So then, Night Watchman, on that note, take us home, buddy.
Well, before we take us home, I also just want to reference there's one writer who would have been invited to this panel that is still with us. I just
Greg
want to
Tate,
reference
baby.
Greg
I know
Tate,
you're going. Yes.
You know,
yes.
And the work that he did in here, and so on whatever realm he is, I hope he's watching this and letting us know we still appreciate the work he did.
Absolutely.
So you've been listening to Soul Lounge Primetime on WHCR 90.3 FM, the voice of Harlem. Also live streaming on YouTube and Facebook. You can always find us on Monday nights, 7 p.m. on the radio and 8 o'clock on your favorite channel, as long as it's either YouTube or Facebook. Thank you. You will not find us on any X or Twitter or any of those channels.
Wow.
So, we not found on any white supremacist social media.
Wow.
Night Watchman.
I said it. Yeah, now I'm probably going to get audited, but
it's not your fault.
Exactly. Wow. So thank you guys for joining us, and we'll see you at the cookout.
Yes, gentlemen. Thank you guys. Excellent.
All of you guys, the best.
Yeah.